I want to announce the book that you've seen in the foyer. It's just released, as you can see. And what is this book all about? So that's part of what we'll be doing today. If you look at the top line here, it's a comprehensive survey of the methods for measuring multidimensional quality. And comprehensive, we get into all the different nooks and crannies of the ways of measuring multidimensional quality. It illustrates the state-of-the-art quantitative approach to measuring multidimensional quality. Now, I should mention that we start with qualitative approaches and convert them to quantitative. That's part of the interesting aspect of this approach. Then finally, it's a unique guide to viewing multidimensional quality. Now, what I mean by that is unique because it hasn't had, any other guide hasn't had as much of the most new results that are just coming out, some of which you saw this afternoon in the multidimensional quality release, MPI release. So here is the list of contents. If you've had a chance to look at the book, you've seen this. The first part is all the stuff that happened before Sabina and I put together a new approach to looking at multidimensional quality. And the second half looks at what you do once you have this multidimensional quality measure. How do you deal with robustness and other issues? But I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to leave this for my colleague, Sabina Alkire. Sabina, I hand the baton.
Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is just in a couple of minutes give a little bit of the background in terms of the intellectual landscape that we've really benefited from in studying multidimensional poverty. And clearly we begin with Amartya Sen's capability approach. Amartya Sen describes poor people as being battered by many disadvantages at the same time. So his description of the multidimensionality of poverty, as well as capability as being the space in which to assess it, motivates our own work, as does his unembarrassed acknowledgement that in designing measures to capture this multidimensional poverty, we do need to engage in value judgments. And so that work is in a sense part of the normative motivation, which we also see to be in a sense coherent with participatory approaches from human rights, from Ubuntu, from social exclusion, and other frameworks which have also discussed many of the overlapping issues. In terms of the empirical motivation, for many of us, it was in a sense sparked by Frances Stewart's observation in her book that, for example, 53% of malnourished children in India did not live in income-poor households. And this work is also explored by Bourguignon et al. In a paper where they look at data from 1990 to 2005, and they look at the level and trend of poverty measured by $1.25 a day, and non-monetary Millennium Development Goals such as infant mortality, primary education, and gender parity in schooling, and find that very low associations between the two, either in levels or trends. And so there's a need, perhaps, to look for other measures because income is not an adequate proxy. And finally, in terms of policy, we must acknowledge a very large debt to Tony Atkinson, who has been very active in the policy sphere alongside the academic, working on social exclusion measures and social indicators. And it was his article in 2003 which urged people working in the axiomatic tradition to engage the counting approaches because these indeed had a precedence in the policy sphere, which sparked our own interest. In terms of methodologies, Chapter 3 goes over many of them. For example, there's been a lot of work in improving indicators one by one and using dashboards, as for example Martin Ravallion shows that these still have ongoing relevance for the study of poverty in its many dimensions. And there's a large literature on the design of composite measures, whether it's Altelli et al.'s book or Anne-Catherine Guillot's work, which both look at how to identify reliable and valid indicators and also how to assess the robustness of the resulting indices. While the methodologies are different for us, we have tried to duplicate some of their kinds of explorations in our own framework. And then there are the different methodologies which look at the joint distribution of disadvantages, as we do. Duclos and Younger extended the dominance approaches to the multidimensional space to identify when you can compare distributions without necessarily fixing poverty cutoffs or weights or functional forms of making an aggregate measure. In terms of statistical methods of exploring data, principal components analysis, multiple correspondence analysis, factor or cluster analysis, Louis-Marie Asselin's work, also Vipulakuklas's work and others, have really gone into those methodologies that we try in a small way to draw upon, as well as to identify some difficulties in that approach. And then Lenny and Betty, or Chiapardo Netti and others, have used a fuzzy approach. They, in a sense, try to implement Sen's observation that it's better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. And sometimes we don't precisely know who's poor. And so by setting an upper and lower poverty cutoff and having a membership function in the middle, we can perhaps have a more accurate framework for measurement using the fuzzy set approach. And then our own work is part of an axiomatic tradition, which in a sense began in 1998 with Chakravarti and others. Sui, Bergino, and Chakravarti have really articulated many of the axioms and considerations that multidimensional poverty measures could consider, and our work clearly benefits from theirs. And then in preparing the book, we had the benefit of being able to read a great deal from the counting literature in Latin America, in Europe, in the Middle East, both reading of the methodologies that have been implemented and with even greater interest of the ways that policies had interacted with those measures. And we're very grateful for Brian Nolan, both for being here, but also for the work that we have been able to read and attempt to learn from. So that's a little bit, in a sense, of the landscape with which we interact. And I would simply mention also that when it comes to our own framework, we very much draw centrally on Sen's work in measurement in 1976, where he argues we need to identify the space of measure, identify who is poor, and then select a way of aggregating information on poor people into an overall measure of poverty. Because of our interest in the policy space, we also draw a great deal on the Foster-Thorbecke class of measures, both because they are the most widely implemented class of income poverty measures, and also because they have the properties of decomposability, which are often required in policy settings. And then because we retain an interest in trying to apply the capability approach, we draw on a whole range of authors who have sought to discuss how best to do that empirically, beginning with Andrea Brandolini and Alessio and their work to implement a counting-based functional measure. So with this introduction, I turn it back to James.
So what is this methodology all about? I thought I'd put you through a bit of the standard discussion of mathematics and so on. It's real. This is a matrix. It means something, and I'll explain what each column and each entry means, all right? This is an example, okay? In the left-hand side, in the vertical column, you see dollars a day that a family or an individual is receiving, okay? So this is a measure of income, if you will. So the individual person, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 4 persons. There are 4 dimensions. First dimension refers to income, right? So this is the data that you might see in creating a multidimensional poverty indicator. Second is, for example, years of schooling. So 11 years, 10 years. The person down at the bottom has 11 years. The person at the top has 14 years. The next column would have self-reported health, for example, with 5 being a high level of self-reported health, excellent health, 1 being poor health, the next 2 fair, etc., etc. But notice that the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, the 5, they only stand for categories. They don't have any cardinal meaning in and of themselves, and yet we can still use them with this approach. So this is an interesting feature of the approach, that it deals with ordinal as well as cardinal variables. Finally, the final column has an example of service of some type that's being provided to people. Say it's access to health care. Let's make it access to health insurance, because I'm from the United States. So access to health insurance. 1 if you have access, 0 if you do not. Right. So these are the data. How do we measure poverty for these people? That's the question that we ask. The first step is set deprivation cutoffs. There are natural deprivation cutoffs in income in the US. This is very near to what the income cutoff was when we started doing this exercise a few years ago. $13 a day. 12 years of education, of schooling, actually not education, we call it schooling, because we can't be measuring what the real underlying level of education is based on years. But 12 years is associated with many good or bad things happening. If you don't have a high school education in the US, your health is much worse. You can't get that good job. Many other dimensions, things go badly. And so therefore, this is a natural cutoff those who do succeed in graduating high school and those who do not. Finally, if you have, well, actually not finally, if you have a good level of health, that's 3, okay, then you are considered not to be deprived. If you are below 3, so you're 1 or 2, that is poor or fair, you're considered to be deprived in health. Finally, there is not having access to the social service that you're looking at. So that's 0, the only one that's below the 1 cutoff. So the cutoff below is 1. If you're underneath that, you're considered to be deprived. If you have 1, then you're not considered to be deprived. So who are deprived in which dimensions? You can compare directly, but here's a good shorthand. The ones that are underlying are the ones that are deprived. Now, what we can do is move back from the numbers and look at this as a 0-1 state of affairs. You're deprived or not in each dimension. And so we get what's called the deprivation matrix. 1 if deprived, 0 if not. All right. So what happens if we actually think that one dimension is more important than another? Then it might be appropriate to use a different kind of weighting structure than an equal weight. So for instance, we might imagine that first entry is not that important, income isn't that important. Let's put half of a weight on it, a little bit. Right now we have 1, 1, 1, 1, meaning each deprivation counts the same. Now let's say we put a half on the first one and 1.5 on the second one, and 1, 1 thereafter. As a result, we would get a matrix on the right-hand side whose first column entries would have 0.5, indicating it's not as important as the next one to the right, which would be 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. This would be a weighted deprivation matrix, keying to you what the value of each deprivation would be. All right. So now, let's, just for the sake of the argument, pull us back to equal weighting case, because it's easier to explain and I don't have to keep drawing W's everywhere. So we get the matrix, the weighted deprivation matrix, as follows. It looks just like the deprivation matrix, because we have a 1 for each of the dimensions. They all add up to 4. So here's what we start off with. Look at each person. Count the number of deprivations equally weighted. The first one has 0, no deprivations. Seems not a very good candidate for being poor. The next one has 2, the next one has 4, the next one has 1. All right. Who's poor? All right. So then, one way we could consider defining who's poor is by saying, hey, if you're deprived, you're poor, that's it. So this is a union approach to setting the, identifying who would be poor. Well, by this definition, it looks like the lower 3 people all would qualify. But if you examine the union approach, if you look at a case where everyone who's deprived in anything is considered poor, you often get vast numbers of poor people. So that it becomes not a very good way of prioritizing who's poor, since so many people are. Well, maybe we should look another way. Let's define the intersection approach. The intersection approach says that you're deprived. If you're poor, if you're deprived in all dimensions at once. So you're poor if you're deprived in all dimensions at once. If Ci, the number of deprivations, is equal to 4 in this case. Who's poor here? Well, you have one person who's poor. And in fact, this is common because many times, if you look at data sets, you find that only one person, or a few number, in fact, in some data sets, you have 0% that would be poor by an intersection approach. So, in fact, come over here, this is an example. If we look at this example with, from India, it's where we've have 10 dimensions, and a union approach nets about 91% of the population being poor. A intersection approach nets 0, and so we want to have something in between in order for it to make sense that we're actually prioritizing and dividing up the population into poor and non-poor. So how do we do that? We choose something in between. For those of you who are worried that we're being a bit arbitrary, guess what? Every poverty line you might choose in income space is in some sense arbitrary, 1.25. Great example. So let's consider k equals 2 for the sake of the argument. Look who is poor. It would be these 2 persons here. All right? So you have 2 people who are poor. Now, how can we aggregate up to get a measure of poverty? So we've identified who's poor. Now, what's the overall level of poverty? I think that those, first thing we need to do is to get rid of the person who's not poor. Because the bottom person is deprived in one dimension, but that person did not cut it. So we remove the deprivation of that person. We're not interested in counting deprivations among the non-poor. And so we get a censored weighted deprivation matrix. That will be the basis of our aggregation, of our method of combining all the data into one measure of poverty. I know one way of doing it. Why don't we say that we'll count the number of people who are poor, divided by the total number of people, and that's our measure of poverty called the headcount ratio, or the poverty rate. A great measure. Except when you start thinking, what happens if person 2 becomes deprived in the income dimension? Well, we would hope that if a poor person who's already suffering is deprived in an additional dimension, that it would increase poverty. But what happens to the headcount ratio? We have nothing happening. It's still 2 out of 4 who are poor. We don't represent that increase in any way. This violates an axiom that we call dimensional monotonicity that requires poverty to rise when a poor person becomes deprived in an additional dimension. So, actually, how could we make a measure that would incorporate this information? Perhaps we need to look once again at the counting on the right-hand side. The deprivation share among the poor is 2 out of 4 for the second person and 4 out of 4 for the third person. Those numbers are relevant. They're indicating the breadth of poverty. So let's take that average across the poor people, it's 3/4, and call it the average deprivation share among the poor. That information is relevant. Why don't we combine it with the headcount ratio to get an overall indicator called the adjusted headcount ratio, M times A. As we can see, 1/2 times 3/4, the average intensity, is equal to 0.375. But this is not the only way we can calculate this measure. Look back at the matrix. Notice something, that if you added up all the entries in the matrix, you would get 6. If you had a world in which everyone was maximally deprived, you would have 16. So 6 out of 16 might define, in some sense, how poor off the society is. In fact, take the mean of that matrix, 6 over 16, and that becomes a nice measure of poverty when you think, oops, it's the same number. In fact, you can calculate it this way as well as the previous way, get exactly the same number each time, and anyone who does statistical analysis knows the benefit of using a mean of some sort. Okay, so here is the adjusted headcount ratio. Suppose the number of deprivations rises for that person again. We can see that that person's average deprivation share has risen to 3/4, hence raising the M0 adjusted headcount ratio, satisfying dimensional monotonicity. This is satisfactory. Okay, so let me summarize. This methodology has a very nice interpretation. It conveys information on the extent of deprivation. In fact, multiple deprivations. That's what the notion of poverty that lies behind this. The more multiply deprived you are, the more poor you are. Applicability. It's valid for the ordinal data. The self-reported health, you didn't even notice. We've been using it all along. We could just as easily have used whether you had dirt floor or non-dirt floor, some natural materials, etc. As long as you can categorize when someone is deprived and not, it can be used. It's easy to compute. I saw that mean, that M times A, very easy to understand, and it satisfies 2 very important properties. The so-called subgroup decomposition, which was one of the properties of the FGT measures that made it very important for use by the World Bank and other structures that were trying to do analysis regionally and linking it overall to the country. So I could take the poverty in this section of the room, the poverty in that section of the room, and link it in a way that's very straightforward. The average, we average it up using population shares across the 2 regions. And this always happens. So it means that you have very interesting forms of subgroup consistency. If poverty rises here, then overall poverty will rise. Also, dimensional breakdown, by which we now look at each dimension. There's a censored headcount ratio that says, what's the percentage of people who are both poor and deprived in a given dimension? For each dimension, you have a censored headcount ratio. Guess what? You can average those up using the weights in order to get an overall level of M0 again. So you can see what each dimension is contributing to overall poverty. Well, that's my story. I'll turn it over to Sabina. Thank you.
So in the remaining chapters of the book, in a sense, we pause and we say, well, if this is a methodology to use, then how do we implement it and how do we analyze it? So we begin with the normative issues, which perhaps could seem the most difficult. What is the purpose of the measure? Because that will shape a lot of the design decisions within it. What is the space in which poverty is to be measured? Is it resources or capabilities, functionings, service delivery, or some other space? And then we go one by one through the choice of dimensions, indicators, deprivation cutoffs, poverty cutoffs, and weights, and discuss, in a sense, the normative side of the equation. How does it cohere either with public debates or with participatory exercises that involve poor communities, and so try to match the reality of poverty in different places. And then also, what are the existing normative frameworks that a society might have, which could be a constitution or a law, as in the case of Mexico, could be an agreement on human rights, as in the case of a child poverty measure. It could be a national development plan, as in the case of Colombia's national measure. And how can these be used also to structure the design decisions, both for indicators and for targets or deprivation cutoffs of the indicators? In Chapter 7, we then turn to a lot of the data issues, looking at, for example, how to assess redundancy or associations across different indicators. And we also draw attention to some of the distinctive data issues that we need to look for if we are implementing measures that are trying to capture the joint distribution of disadvantages for each person or each household. In particular, for example, the data have to be accurate at the individual level, not on average. So if you have a 24-hour time use question, it might be accurate on average, but is my last 24 hours representative of my life over the past year or two, whatever is the distance between surveys? Similarly with a 7-day consumption recall or a 2-week ill health record. One needs to think of recall periods, although long recall periods have greater non-sample measurement error. But these are some of the trade-offs and considerations which come in this distinctive way of putting together the microdata. In Chapter 8, we then consider standard errors, analytical and bootstrap standard errors, and statistical inference. But our basic question is, how do we know if the measures are robust? And how do we know if our comparisons across time or across regions are significant? And we get into the techniques of testing for robustness, to poverty cutoffs, to weights, to deprivation cutoffs. And we also look at issues of demographics and household composition, although this is very much a work in progress, as are other sections of the book. And then in Chapter 9, we move across time, both with repeated cross-sectional data, developing that set of statistics, and with panel data, illustrating both the chronic multidimensional poverty measure and also some of the new analysis that can be done by looking at the chronically poor, those who fall into poverty, rise out of poverty, or churn in and out. We also develop a measure of inequality among the poor or among regions or other groups, to try to look beyond just the average intensity of poverty. And then finally, in Chapter 10, we turn towards policy analysis, showing the generalized linear modeling, which is the framework for this analysis, and its application with microdata to look at poverty profiles, for example, and with macro modeling to look at determinants of poverty across regions or other groups. So that's a little bit of the shape of the contents. And then just we will close by each of us discussing, in a sense, our hope in terms of how this work might be carried. And one observation is that already some countries are using the structure of this method for official national poverty statistics. Colombia, Bhutan, Chile, and Mexico. And so our hope at one level is that it would be useful for the technical advisors, and also that we will continue to learn from them as we have to date, what are the better methodologies, and also what are the most active unsolved problems. For example, the MPI in Colombia has the 5 indicators and the 5 dimensions and the 15 indicators that match its national development plan. And these are the policy objectives it's seeking to fulfill. What are the different research questions that these might give rise to, whether it's program composition or graduating from CCTs. So that's one group, and then my colleague Jose Manuel Roche will speak about relevance or potential interlaces with civil society groups.
So just 2 slides summarize this. There. What I'm looking into is how international agencies' uses of civil society could use these measures. And so there are at least 2 ways to see this. One is what I call here inward looking, which is to use for program quality. And that is work that actually has been done by different organizations here. There's not any random order, how they are put in there. There is the diagnostic, one is about diagnostic and prioritizations. For example, work done both with Save the Children and with World Vision. At the time that I was here in office as well, and I know that we still explore this, look at how to identify who are the group of children that are worse off, and then how to prioritize, not necessarily to target, but actually to see in what order and with the level of intensity of poverty that children are experiencing in different groups. Another is, of course, related to baseline and monitoring and evaluation tool for the whole programming. So it would be, in that case, any of the NGOs, and I know there's work on OPHI and a colleague that is just here that has been working with OPHI around this, and is using a multidimensional poverty measure on empowerment, and then see how programs that OPHI is doing on empowerment are actually increasing empowerment among the beneficiaries. And so that's, for example, is an example of how it can be used in different domains. So it could be, of course, in poverty, it could be in child poverty when you're focusing on a specific group, it could be a different age group of children, but it could also be on empowerment, it could be around child rights, I don't necessarily only capabilities. So they have different multiple uses as long as it's multidimensional in nature and you are aggregating across. And then, of course, more, say, analytical process on understanding underlying multidimensional processes around say, programming as well, and how what the work that happened in one dimension is also having an effect on other dimensions. And NGOs and international organizations, UNICEF, for example, have worked on this on MODA with child poverty. These international organizations don't escape to be often suffering of the typical silos. So people who work in education, who work in health, they may understand the multidimensional, but when it comes to programming, they work in very strong silos. Then the multidimensional measures force the organization to start thinking on the trade-off between silos and how they complement each other. And that, of course, means that when we discuss this, and I have experience in SAFE, means that people would actually disagree and start debating about it, which is precisely what you expect and what you want when you present it. And then the next point is more outward looking, and that has to do more with policy and research and advocacy, and that's work, for example, done by UNDP with the MPI and the Human Development Report, but also work for example, CEPAL, with the Panorama Social and also measure of poverty at the country level, or UNICEF on child poverty. So there are different work again. I don't think I need to list them, but that had to do both also on analysis more on policy and the evidence-based advocacy as well, and then some work that had to do, especially for civil society, very useful, had to do with accountability and holding government to account, which is perhaps one of the main roles that, in terms of accountability, civil society play. And I pass it then to, I think, Schumann.
Thank you, Jose. So now I quickly will talk about how this book, or the materials and contents of the book, can be used for teaching. The way the material has been designed in the book, it should be especially useful for designing quantitative courses on masters and at the master's or at the PhD level across different disciplines. Of course, it can be used to develop a sole course on poverty measurement. What the book does, it provides a comprehensive overview for those who will be designing the course. And of course, the person will be using other newer materials to develop the course, but this book will provide a comprehensive overview of the literature. Another contribution of the book is that it provides a unified notation. When we looked at different literature of measurement, we found different types of notation, and it was a challenge for all of us to sit together and agree on a common framework. And we believe this is going to be useful when while designing a particular course. We have devoted an entire website for the book, and it's called multidimensionalpoverty.org. Through the website, we have made available chapters, each of the 10 chapters, review presentations, PowerPoints, paper exercises, as well as data files that students can use to learn things in practice. So let me very quickly show you how our website is built. So this is the website called multidimensionalpoverty.org, where we have all the chapters available. So if you click on the chapter, it takes you to this particular page where we have all chapters listed. Now if you want to use a particular chapter, which is chapter 3, suppose here, then it will directly take you here, where you can either read the full chapter as HTML, or you may download the chapter as a PDF material. Then, among resources, we have made available our online videos here. For example, this is a video recorded by Alkire on chapter 1, and so on. So each chapter has its own video. And then, through this OPHI online training portal, we have made available different slides and exercises. So the slides are on PowerPoint and also on PDF, and there are exercises, paper exercises, and so on. So we are working at this moment. This is also a work in progress, developing the website, where we are aiming to make different exercises made available, so that when students are reading the chapter or even teaching, you can also use those exercises and the data files to use them for proper learning. So this is how different way we can use the book. Now I will leave to Paula to talk about different kind of future research that is going to be facilitated.
Thank you, Shuman. Hussein and Shuman have presented two forms in which this book could be useful. So I will be presenting you some research questions that could be addressed with the book. Broadly speaking, we can think of the book in terms of descriptive or inferential research questions within the broad theme of empirical research questions. So one may be interested, for example, in finding new measures, such as a comparable M0 measure across OECD countries. Within this descriptive group of empirical research questions, we can also think of applied measures, such as measures for health poverty, child poverty, or elderly poverty. Within the inferential side, when I mean inferential, I refer to going beyond the descriptive analysis of poverty, we may think of assessing the transmission mechanisms between policies, such as trade policies or fiscal policies, and multidimensional poverty. Clearly there, a researcher who's interested in assessing these questions would need to think about the methods, techniques, that could help us answer these questions. Here we can think of maybe two: regressions at the micro level, where the unit of analysis may be the person or the household that we're studying, or maybe at the more macro level, where we would have an aggregate, maybe a spatial aggregate, a province, or maybe a socioeconomic group. But we can also think about impact evaluation analysis, which I think is an area that has not been explored yet. But we can also consider methodological research questions. And here we think that researchers may be interested in assessing these research questions in terms of measurement or data analysis. So in measurement, one may like to develop new axioms, for example, for distributional analysis purposes. Or you may consider thinking about standards for robustness analysis. We have dealt with that topic in the book widely in Chapter 8, but there's still much room to be done. And there, I think it's important to consider that behind the construction of a measure, there's always the process of validating the measure. So robustness analysis is still an area that needs to be explored. Within the data analysis side, clearly we deal with data sets. And as such, we need to deal with the treatment of missing values. There is, I would say, a deep discussion on how to deal with these missing values in Chapter 7, but there's much still to be done, as well as in the treatment of climate data and demographics, especially when it concerns to a dynamic analysis report. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. I'm sure you've got questions on, there's such a range of issues there, but can you hold your questions just so you can hear two of the discussants? I'll call up now Professor Brian Nolan. We are very grateful to him. Professor Nolan is Professor of Social Policy at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention, but our person particularly is the Director of Employment, Equity and Growth Program of the Institute for New Economic Thinking.
Hello. It's a great pleasure indeed to be here. Very much appreciated the invitation. I should start with the caveats or qualifications, if you like. I'm reminded rather of the character in the play who haven't got beyond A in the encyclopedia. So I haven't got beyond developed countries in my work. So I should make it clear that the perspective that I'm speaking from is somebody who's been analysing poverty, social exclusion, deprivation in a rich country context. And what I want to come back to is how valuable what we have here encapsulated in this book is for that purpose, as well as the use to which it's been put across developing countries. So I think this is a huge achievement. I guess poverty measurement is an intrinsically, it's characterized by a sometimes healthy, sometimes not so healthy, sort of pragmatic approach, where a question that's asked, perhaps more than other social science research is, yes, but how much use is it? And the answer here is, it's enormously useful and enormously valuable, this analytical framework that has been developed. But what's striking is the extent to which its usefulness is married to a quite remarkable degree of scientific rigor, and what's reflected in the output is the very clear commitment from the outset to attaining both the highest levels of scientific rigor and a resolute commitment to being useful. And both the analytical frameworks and methods and the concrete results are enormously valuable and helpful, not just for policymakers, but for those who want to understand the world they live in and debate these hugely important issues. I'm reminded a little bit of, I'm Irish, and we had a Prime Minister not so long ago who had the severe limitation that he was an economist by training. And the perhaps apocryphal story is that when faced with a response to a particular problem, he said, well, that's fine in practice, but does it work in theory? I knew him a bit, but I never had the courage to actually ask him, was this apocryphal? So I guess this will be the question that now we can ask of poverty measures and poverty measurement. It's not just, is it useful, and do we in some sense find the results convincing and useful, but how does it fit within the framework that we've had outlined for us so succinctly but clearly here today, and is set out very clearly indeed really with a remarkable degree of detail and honesty in the book. What's very clear from the whole approach is the multiple objectives that one is trying to achieve in measuring poverty, deprivation and exclusion. Obviously one's trying to capture progress and its absence, trying to serve as a guide for policy, including perhaps in setting targets, and develop a set of tools that can be replicated and used in different environments. I think that the authors, Svina, James, Schumann, Maria, Jose, and Paolo, are to be enormously warmly congratulated for the success with which, in this book, they brought together the results of years of work. I think if you were looking from the outside and weren't very well informed, you would have assumed that OPHI was a very large institution with multiple teams of researchers beavering away for years. And it's really remarkable how much has been achieved with the resources that were available. What is clear from the presentation today is that the methodology is striving both for a range of scientifically important characteristics, including the decomposability that Jim emphasized, which I think is enormously helpful, while also doing its very best to achieve an objective that is acknowledged in the book to be central, which is to be intuitive, to be understood by those who are going to be absorbing and using the results. That's a very real challenge, which they have been grappling with and have undoubtedly done their very best with. In a sense, it's one of the core criticisms of approaches to trying to summarize poverty that aggregate into a single number. And so the approach taken here, that the usual criticism is that at the end of the day it's a bit of a black box and you don't know where the number came from and you sort of take it on trust, you take it on faith. So the effort here has been to underpin the headline number with an apparatus, an analytical apparatus, that not only allows you to explain where the numbers came from, but allows you to dive down in and to unpick how this headline number is the one that you're being asked to focus on, and where it came from, how it's built up from different dimensions and how it can be decomposed into who is experiencing what sorts of deprivation. I'd be very interested to hear in the discussion the experience of the authors in trying to convey the intuition behind these measures, and whether that has been a serious act to it. And in a sense, that's one of the characteristics, one of the features of aggregate measures that has led some to focus more on what's referred to here and more generally as the dashboard approach, where rather than trying to aggregate, you present a series of indicators covering distinct areas. And I think, I'm sure the authors would agree that has its uses as well. And that what they're presenting here is complementary to, rather than a replacement for, the dashboard approach. What this method allows you to do, of course, is not only to capture individual deprivations, but the relationships between them. And that's absolutely central to understanding not just the severity and seriousness of deprivation as it affects particular people, but what's driving, what are the causal mechanisms underlying those deprivations. And that's absolutely critical, and an area where I think really rather limited progress has been made. And just to give an example from the developed countries, one of the motivations for moving beyond income is that, which is articulated nicely in the book, is that empirically income-poor households below conventional income poverty lines, are often not, the households you would identify as such often don't overlap very strongly with households who are experiencing deprivation and exclusion in other domains. It tends to be the assumption that this is due to the fact we're measuring income in a snapshot and deprivation is perhaps capturing longer-term processes. But in fact, even when we have longitudinal data for quite a long time and of a high quality, that goes some way, but not all that far, in explaining that mismatch. So that reinforces the argument for trying to both capture those overlaps, but also understand both the overlaps and the non-overlaps. So I guess one thing that the team will have thought about at length is whether there is information being set aside here. I won't use lost because it's still there, but it's set aside for the purpose of the measurement exercise, if you like. Is there information that has been put to one side that we might, for certain purposes, like to go back and look at? And I guess that's of at least two types. And one is deprivation among the non-poor, those who are being counted, depending on where you set your thresholds and cutoffs and so on, and how you do the aggregation. Those the deprivations that are being discounted. The second is the information about the level of your deprivation. If you're not deprived, how far above the threshold are you? For example, if you're not poor, how much income have you? Are you very well above the threshold, or are you just above it? Or if you're below, how far below? Now, in the method, there's ways certainly of catering for the latter. You can complement, you can supplement with severity indices and so on. But in terms of the question about how far above the threshold you are, I guess I wonder, do we think about that differently in a rich country context than we might in the developing country context? For example, one of the examples used is that achieving non-deprivation in one dimension, such as having clean water, doesn't erase the deprivation in another dimension, like malnutrition. I guess if we put it in the rich country context, so does how far you're above the poverty line affect how we think about something that you then report as a deprivation? Well, this is a question that is a constant issue in the context of rich countries. Sometimes to the point where, for example, somebody's living standards are examined and we see that the comment is made, well, they have a skybox, so they mustn't be poor. I'm alas doing this sort of work long enough to remember when that comment was, they have a television, so they mustn't be poor. So there are clearly we have to understand the circumstances, the full circumstances in which people are living and the choices they're making. But nonetheless, knowing how far above the income threshold one is I think, an important piece. The book is extremely rigorous and detailed in discussing the very wide range of choices that have to be made, that are made in this method, but have to be made anyway, implicitly or explicitly, in trying to achieve the purpose of measuring poverty and exclusion, multidimensional poverty and exclusion. What I'd really like to hear from the authors, and we heard something of, is which of these choices are the ones that are most questioned and debated and challenged in implementation? Because I suspect we might sometimes be surprised by that. And which are the ones that, in some sense, they don't get asked about, that they expected to get a lot of attention paid to. So I think that's a really interesting consideration. Of course, one of the choices that one has to make is, in terms of dimensions, what one's going to count as a dimension. And in a rich country context, one of the debates that tends to happen is, are we going to count income and low income poverty, as a dimension and include it in the measure? And are we going to count subjective measures of lack of happiness, lack of well-being, stress of various sorts and so on? Are we going to include them as distinct dimensions? Or are we going to leave them, if you like, outside the measure and then try and understand the relationship between low income and measured multidimensional deprivation, or indeed subjective measures and those multidimensional measures? So that's an ongoing debate, which I think will matter on. What I'd like to finish by emphasizing is just how important and helpful this work is in a developed country context, the one I'm familiar with. And just to illustrate that with the European Union context, where, as many of you will know, the European Union, having adopted, in some sense, a dashboard approach of adopting a set of social inclusion indicators, then, some years later, adopted a headline poverty target, which is on what is being referred to here as the Union approach, where relative income poverty, material deprivation, and household joblessness have been, if you like, taken as the three core indicators. And the Commission has argued that the computation of a single indicator is an effective way of communicating in a political environment and a necessary tool in order to monitor 27 different national situations. Well, up to our point, I think the ad hoc manner in which the measure was arrived at is a handicap. The limited understanding of how these indicators relate to each other is certainly a handicap. But what perhaps it illustrates more than anything else is that certainly the setting of poverty targets, if not the measurement of poverty itself, is an inherently political exercise. And the European Union's poverty target ended up that way because that was regarded as capturing what at least the governments of the member states wanted to see captured. And that's the core consideration in thinking about poverty targets, is how one can achieve that objective, but within a framework which allows the analysis of the causes of poverty and the policies aimed at directing at addressing it, how that analysis can be framed in a way that is then transferable and understandable. And I think that's what this enormously important book contributes very substantially to. So I'd like to congratulate the authors again on your behalf.
If one Irishman compared to another Irishman, I'm from the other end of the island, I'm afraid. But I think that was extraordinary because we have someone who starts by saying he doesn't have a background in development, but actually gives, pays the authors the compliment of actually discussing the book, which is a rare thing in book launches, I find. So, but let's move. You've thrown up a whole wealth of questions, which I'm sure the panel will like to discuss. But we can't do that now. We have really. Let's get someone who does know about development in developing countries. Professor Francis Stewart, who doesn't need any introduction to his audience, should really be introduced. Francis.
Right. Well, I think this is late in the day, and I think very much of what I've got to say has been said. But I want to start by saying that I think this book is a really important book. It's a really important book to development and also to it's a globally important book. And I think it's important because we often underestimate how important measurement is. Because how we measure something determines what we're going to do. If we measure monetary poverty or income poverty, then what we're going to be worried about is monetary and income poverty. And so it provides the basis for policy, it provides the basis for policy evaluation, it determines policy goes in one direction and not another. The headline is going to be poverty is up, poverty is down, but it's just related to the dimension that you're measuring. So measurement is critical. It sounds quite dry, and we should be worried about what's going on in developing countries, but we can't even begin to be worried until we have done some measurement. Now, monetary or income poverty has been totally dominant, and I think developed countries are well in advance in this, but it's been totally dominant in developing countries, led by the approach of the World Bank. And it has so many defects, I can't really begin to delineate them. First of all, it misidentifies how much poverty there is the minute one moves outside the narrow thing, which is income, and moves to real deprivations that people suffer. It misidentifies who is poor. I mean, work we've done, work others have done, shown that 50% of the people that you identify as poor in one with income poverty are maybe not poor in all sorts of really serious deprivations, but another 50%, completely other people who you're not even looking at, are poor in serious deprivations, including things like nutrition, which is supposed to be the basis of the income poverty. But they're not captured by the income poverty. It misidentifies the relevant policy, it points all the time to income, but you can give people income, but if there aren't health services around, what's going to happen? If there aren't education services around, what's going to happen? There are a lot of non-material deprivations, which are hugely important. People's sense of self-respect, their employment, their political freedoms. You give people income, but you don't do anything about those things. So measuring the wrong thing, which is what's been happening, is really damaging. And one thing I should say is, people think that the income measure really means something and it's got some sort of respectability. It's been used so long, it's got so many sophisticated equations and articles and things about it. Research has all been devoted to what causes it, what the consequences. If you actually explore what's underneath, there are so many arbitrary judgments. There are so many arbitrary judgments that even if you just stick to income poverty, some people have shown that you might get a figure of 20%, you might get a figure of 80%. For the same country, the same data set, depending on what decisions you take about size of family, economies of scale, missing data, and so on and so forth. So it's a completely sort of nonsensical measure, particularly when it turns out it doesn't even measure the real deprivation. So it's so important to get away from this, this measure of poverty. Now, I think now multidimensionality of poverty as a phenomenon is really widely recognised, partly due to OPHI's work, but it's been coming slowly over the years due to multi-ascend, due to basic needs, and so on and so forth. And it has been recognised, for example, in the MDGs, which is very much a multidimensional approach. But what they don't have is a single measure. And the single measure is so important because, like, the dashboard is fine, but when you're going to actually get people to move on things and you present them with this huge dashboard, and then someone else comes along with your income poverty and says it's 22.3%, and these are the people, and you've got this dashboard and you can't say anything simple at all. You need one figure. And there is also, of course, the fact that the dashboard does not allow for joint deprivations, which is very important. So, I think it's really important that we have a multidimensional measure. And the beauty of the Alkire-Foster method is manifold. But first, it does allow for joint deprivations, so that people are more poor if they're deprived in more dimensions, which is reflects a sort of intuitive reality. Secondly, it's flexible about which deprivations should be included and how many, and you can be very consultative about which ones you decide to include, how many, and so on. So you can move to more or less and still get a very reasonable sort of figure, a single figure out of it all. It's flexible about cut-off points. I mean, obviously it's quite arbitrary what your cut-off point is going to be, but you can be flexible and you can, again, decide that on a societal basis. It can be decomposed by group, which I think is hugely important. I work a lot on groups, so of course this is the thing I mind about, but it's not only ethnic groups, racial groups and so on, but age groups, which is a big topic for this country. What's happening to children, what's happening to old people, and so on and so forth. So you can do that. And then, of course, it points to appropriate policies, because you can see where people are deprived, and you can see what policies are. It points to who you should target, because you can see who's poor again. And I think, and this is a very important, probably understated contribution, it is and has and will stimulate data collection. Because you go to a country, someone comes to Sabina and says, I want to do this multidimensional poverty. She looks at the data and says, sorry, you can't do it. You've got to collect data on this, that, and the other important dimensions. And I think it is beginning to get a much more systematic global data collection. So, the MDGs, as I said, are multidimensional, but they haven't got a single measure. The SDGs look like they may move in the same direction, but hopefully they should adopt the this method, the Alkire-Foster method, and they've got a book to see exactly how they should do it. And I do hope it's getting, I think the UNDP has been great in taking this up, but it needs to be taken up in a systematic way, properly financed, not everybody working until 3 a.m. and getting up at 6 a.m. in a tiny little outhouse in Oxford in order to contribute, in order to do this. It's too important. So I just conclude by saying I think it's a tremendous book. I congratulate Sabina, I congratulate James and Jose Manuel and Schumann and Paula. I think it's absolutely great, and carry on. Thank you.